Welcome to Language Access Matters, the podcast where we pull back the curtain on one of the most important and most overlooked pillars of equity in this country, the right to understand and be understood. I'm your host, Carol Velandia, and whether you are a language professional, a healthcare provider, an advocate, or simply someone who believes that every person deserves a fair shot regardless of the language they speak, you are in the right place. Today's episode is one I've been looking forward to for a long time, partly because we couldn't record it the first time. So I'm so excited to be here to talk about linguistic validation. So many of us assume that once something is translated, it's automatically understandable and fair. But anyone who has worked with multilingual communities knows that's not the whole story. There is a vast and often invisible gap between something that is technically translated and something that is truly understood or understandable. Today, we're sitting down with two people who live and work in that gap every single day, exploring how health messages, clinical questionnaires, and patient materials can be adapted so they don't just cross a language barrier, but actually land with meaning, clarity, and cultural resonance for the people they're meant to serve. Their work asks a simple but radical question. Does this health message actually make sense to the person reading or hearing it? In their own language, in their own reality, in their own lived experience. For those of us fighting for language access in hospitals, clinics, schools, and courts, their lens helps us move from checking a box to making sure people feel safe, informed, and seen. Let me introduce today's guests. Mark Gibson is the founder of Gibson Research Consultancy, a UK-based team specializing in patient-centered research and linguistic validation for clinical outcome assessments and health communication. His work focuses on developing and testing patient-facing tools so they are conceptually equivalent, culturally appropriate, and genuinely understandable across languages. At the heart of everything Mark does is a commitment to the patient's voice, foregrounding the lived experience of patients in different linguistic and cultural contexts and pushing back against the assumptions that translation alone is enough. Through writing, webinars, and collaborations with language professionals around the world, he advocates for thoughtful translatability assessment, asking not just can this be translated, but will this actually be understood and by whom? Mark, welcome to Language Access Matters.
Thank you. You made me look good with that introduction.
And now I'm going to introduce Nur Ferrante Morales, who is a linguistic validation consultant, mentor, and business development leader at Gibson Research Consultancy. She brings a remarkable breadth of experience to her work as a medical translator working across English, French, and Spanish, as an integrative health professional, and as a poet. That combination isn't accidental. It reflects her deep belief that language is not just a tool for information transfer, it's a vehicle for belonging, safety, and human dignity. And by the way, we have a podcast with Nur that has been recorded, I think it was a year ago. Nur and Mark host and co-create the Patient Voice and Linguistic Validation Cafe, a community and podcast space where linguists come together to explore how clinical outcome assessments and patient materials can be adapted to be truly inclusive, culturally sensitive, and empowering for the people they serve. She is a recognized public voice on linguistic validation, language equity, and patient-centered care, and she consistently reminds us that when patients can trust the language used in their care, they can fully trust their care. Nur, it's wonderful to have you back. Welcome, both of you. I am so excited that this is finally happening.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here again with you.
Yeah, so I want for you to share first that moment in your work when you realized that translating wasn't cutting it, that it was simply not getting the outcomes that you were expecting? When was that moment? So if you can share part of your stories on how you came to the conclusion that something more was needed. And I guess we can start with you, Nur.
All right. Well, in my case, it's curious because, well, I've been translating for 30 years now, in truth. And I always had this sense that depending on which culture I was interacting with, that even though it was the same language, it was absolutely a whole different world. And you needed to really be mindful of many more aspects than simply literally translating something, whether it was during interpreting, some experiences I had interpreting when I first started, and mostly if it implied situations of trauma or situations that were highly loaded emotionally, right? And then I became really aware when I started doing linguistic validation. And well, I had my clinical practice, I had my patients, and in parallel, I was doing medical translation, but I started doing linguistic validation and I started doing patient interviews. And so many things that I assumed were understood when I normally translated for medical texts became like, oh my God, I'm translating literally this. I'm not taking into account so many things. And the patients themselves were the ones that made me realize that I just needed to absolutely change the way I consider translation and become culturally competent. And that was something that I had directly with my patients, no, but we were communicating in Spanish. But it's true that maybe I have to add that it's not entirely true, because I could be culturally competent with them, but I had patients from different minorities and different, like, for example, rural versus urban people and with different ages. And when I had to interact with them, I had to be conscious of diversity and how I would explain to them the process of the treatment, or maybe for them to understand what was going on with their condition, that they wouldn't find help in the with their doctors, and they were reaching out for alternatives. And it was amazing how I had to adapt my discourse, let's say, if it were a person of greater age, or if it was from a rural area than from an urban area, or even sometimes the person from the rural area would be much more open to listen and let's say to understand, and from urban areas they wouldn't. Like, you can't also make assumptions and
Right.
say, well, people from rural areas are not going to get this, and I have to explain these things in a different way, and people from urban areas are going to understand because they normally are more educated and so on. No, so on the one hand, to lose all my let's say my cliches and my prejudices and all those things that I wasn't aware. So that happened the same with medical translation when I had to encounter patient-facing materials. I don't know if I more or less explained.
Oh, yes, I think all those preconceived ideas really confront us when we are in front of a patient and we realize that our toolbox is not cutting it, because that preconceived idea that we had about that person is not is stopping us from really communicating. About you, Mark, tell us about how you came into this work.
I think I started off professional life as a translator and interpreter, a trained one. But I quickly moved to um, sociolinguistics as a discipline, and I was really impressed with just the idea of language, the descriptive approach to language rather than the prescriptive approach to language, which is prevalent in translation. And this is and so I didn't stay in translation long enough for it to be like my trade or anything like that. And so I always kind of felt envious, and I held translators up on a pedestal. I was thinking, oh, I wish I could go. I wish I could have done it right. And then years later, I started working with translators, working because I was working in the area of patient voice research and the development of patient facing materials like medication guides and patient information leaflets. And I've never been so disappointed in my life, to be honest, because these people who are held up on a pedestal, maximum respect to, I quickly realized that there was, no, it doesn't like me bringing this up, a pyramid. Um, and so you have a pyramid of the quality of type of translators there. So on the apex, you have these people who are brilliant, brilliant thinkers. These people bring us Dickens and Dostoevsky and Lorca and all of that. They bring world peace. They're the ones who are actually bringing involved in diplomacy and that kind of thing. They're the ones who are doing the hard work. And then you have a middle band of people who, like medical translators, where they were in a medical career, something happened, and they ended up working as a translator. Perfectly fine people. And then you have a wide band. I won't tell you what I call that band, but it's basically really poor quality translators. And I found myself just time and time again working with that bottom band, just thinking my preconceptions was all translators are brilliant. But I hit the ground with a thud when I was working with these poor quality ones. And so it took me a long time to settle on a group of people that were any good, to be honest. And so this brings us to how I met Nur. So Nur said that she had this network of elite translators, and I didn't believe her. I really didn't believe her. And sure enough,
I didn't say that we had a network of elite.
no, people who you were teaching, people
Yes,
who were
yes.
brought in the course in the linguistic validation cafe. And I was actually, so in the podcast that you were in, Carol, I was still quite hostile to the people in that group because I didn't believe that they were that good, but they are really that good. And um, just people, I've restored my respect. And so these are the people that are changing um, documents from just being patient-facing documents to documents that have resonance to people in the target languages.
Those people are probably the ones that are not going to be replaced by AI because they
Exactly.
have all this nuance that they have integrated into their practice. And I guess for clarity, I would like to ask, you're only referring to the written translation, not the interpreters, although I would say that I find that pyramid quite applicable to interpreters as well. Would you agree with that too? Do you have much experience with interpreters as well?
Yeah, I have some experience with interpreters, and I was an interpreter. In fact, my languages were Spanish, French, and then Portuguese. And my first interpreting job was for the Brazilian football team, Fluminense, which was massive. And I'd only just started teaching myself Portuguese, so um, I was really deficient as an interpreter in that thing, and they were very patient with me. But it was an incredible assignment. So, I mean, one of the things that I'm really interested in is the supposed invisibility of the interpreter. And there's this famous incident recently where a Ukrainian interpreter for the European Commission, I think it was, or the UN or something, was interpreting the testimony of a teenager who had been through sheer trauma. And the interpreter started crying while she was interpreting. The teenager wasn't crying, but the interpreter was crying. And you know, the interpreter in question received a lot of empathy, a lot of support. I think that was terrible. It was a terrible thing to do, because the teenager was looking at her, said, and we don't know what the interpreter had experienced in terms of her personal trauma, but this was not her story. And she was imposing her emotions on that. And I remember seeing a situation where an interpreter was interpreting something about health, and it was a taboo topic in that culture, and the interpreter had to listen to what the patient was saying, and the patient was saying something, and the interpreter went like this. That is absolutely disgusting behavior. And this was on national news. It was on something like CNN or something. I mean, what can you imagine if well, first of all, a doctor is giving you bad news and the doctor starts crying before you start
No,
crying,
no, no, no.
or you're telling a doctor about, I don't know, something embarrassing like
Yeah.
you've picked up gonorrhea or something like that.
Yeah.
And then the doctor goes, that, just, I mean,
Right. So unacceptable. Absolutely.
yeah, it's totally unacceptable. So I definitely see that pyramid applicable there.
And I also want to add, well, so many things that we can speak about from what you both share. Um, but I also think that part of the problem is the huge misunderstanding about what professional interpreters and professional translators do. Um, just to share my side of the story, a lot of people that hire interpreters really don't know what they're hiring for, and they hire bilingual people. And this is not to throw shade on anybody. It's just that I really think there is a lack of understanding of each of the professions. To begin, these professions get interchangeable, and is not and it's very typical that in a healthcare encounter, a healthcare professional would ask an interpreter to translate something. That happens, I guess, more often than the opposite, right? And they're completely different professions. So I think a lot of this is on one hand, the lack of professionalization, and also on the other hand, the lack of understanding of what each profession does. But I think that when I spoke separately with Nur and you in different occasions, I kept going back to one situation with a patient where we were on an eye exam, and the doctor was asking if he could read the letters, and the person was like, I don't distinguish the letter, I don't distinguish the letter. And so then the ophthalmologist or the optometrist was increasing the size of the letter, and then there was this big B on the screen, and the patient kept saying, I don't distinguish the letter. And the doctor was like, that's so weird, your eyes are fine. So I thought he probably doesn't read. He feels ashamed. He doesn't read, and maybe there needs to be some adaptation to this test. And and so that was the question. Is like, sir, do you prefer to use another method? Like, do you recognize numbers? I asked him that. Do you recognize numbers? And now I mean, it's typical that ophthalmologists would know this, right? But I remember that episode early in my career when the patient was clearly not no, it wasn't lack of understanding. It was just that the method used to assess him wasn't translatable, like it wasn't correct. So that was like the first instance where I remember like maybe there is more to just conveying one word from one language to the not to the next language, and that brings me to the concept of translatability. First is a difficult word, but can you either of you tell me how this translatability assessment, what is translatability, and then how does it work in public services or in healthcare?
You go,
No.
Mark.
Rains before beauty, is it? So, yeah, so I mean, translatability is um, it's it's not just about identifying what words are difficult to translate in a given language. So this is before the translation even starts. It's just assessing what would be what what would cause particular problems. But it's about preventing failure of meaning in the target language, and it's about ensuring resonance. So it's not just translating words. Translation is not just translating words, but those words need to land with the target audience. They need to land with what needs to resonate with them in terms of their lives, in terms of their culture. And that's something on as an aside issue, it's something where AI translations fail because the words are fine, but it is just something not right. There's something not right that people just can't latch onto with AI translations, and this is what translatability aims to prevent. And Noah and I have talking about elite linguists. Noah and I have a friend called Mabel Lima. She's based in the US, and she was telling me of an instance of her husband encountering a questionnaire that says, so it was a US questionnaire, and it says, this questionnaire won't take long. It will be as long as it takes you to drink a coffee. And because they are Cuban, so they drink really small coffee, so it's like almost like a shot. So obviously the questionnaire is going to take longer than that, and I've just thought that was such a a beautiful metaphor. And this is the thing that translatability assessments, when done properly, need to identify metaphors as well. Does this metaphor of drinking a coffee resonate with, in this case, Cuban culture?
Yeah,
No, it doesn't.
it
So
doesn't.
that's a good example. Um, and I mean, it's basically translatability is designing in advance for cross-cultural understanding and usability. Action in the US, they like the term actionable. Action, like the FDA likes talking about actionable information, and translatability paves the way for information to be resonant and actionable. That sounds almost half good that I said, how I explained that.
Do you want to add anything, Nor?
Yeah, it's exactly Mark was saying, and in translatability, we take care of, like, let's say, as many aspects as we can in relation to different language families, let's say, and languages that are very culturally different, let's say, from US, English US, or English UK, or whatever is the culture that the source questionnaire has been developed. And there are many aspects of diversity, which is always, for me, like one of the main topics. And these questionnaires are developed by researchers that are, of course, biased by their own culture, and they just can't imagine how many issues, questions as simple as I don't know, maybe what's the level of pain?
I was just
Right?
gonna say that. Yeah, that
Can
is my favorite.
yeah, that you know that you have, or rate your level of pain, can have how different is the experience of pain for people in different countries, cultures, how they may express it, or if they have to like endure the pain and not express it, not say that it's that much, and others that maybe even bad to say it because it makes them, and it's gender different. You know, maybe some men need to show that they are tough and they would never recognize that they are feeling pain. And also there are we take care in translatability assessment of taboos of in taboos that can be, let's say, highly offensive and even traumatizing because they are touching into let's say, historical trauma that culture has, or cultural trauma that we call, and we just can't use it. And then if the questionnaire is validated or published like that without having taken into account all those issues, when we adapt it multiculturally, it's a huge difficulty to try to overcome those barriers and make it non-offensive. Even sometimes the acronyms of the title of the questionnaire are offensive, and developers have no idea what that word means in another country. Mark has some some examples. Could you say, because I don't
Yeah,
remember now.
yeah. There was a HIV questionnaire that was translated in French. So they translated the acronym to PD, which is extremely offensive. And I mean, what an unfortunate coincidence that it has to do with HIV and all of the prejudices that are around that. I mean, that is really dumb, in my opinion.
What's the
And
acronym you
then
said? I'm sorry, just to make sure I heard correctly. The word that was offensive or the expression that was offensive was payday?
PD, so PEDE.
PD. Got you, got you.
yeah.
So it's just the worst homophobic slur that you can think of, really.
Yes, because these questionnaires normally retain like the acronym in English so that it's recognizable in all the different languages, And when they pull together all the data and they collect all the questionnaires from the different sites in different parts of the world, at least, it's recognizable, because it's like a better way to ensure that you're not going to misplace the questionnaire, and in that acronym sometimes creates a word in a different
Hmm.
language, and it's a very offensive, like it's from small details like those to things as offensive as maybe in Pakistan talking about satisfying oneself sexually, or even homosexual relationships, or other So that can, for example, if the person were to answer that questionnaire, it can cause them to be put in jail, right? So that's what translatability assessment tries to prevent and
Yes,
to take care of.
it's so important when you bring up the example of the pain scale. I remember one time when the doctor was not only asking about the pain scale, like from 1 to 10, but then he was asking to a fisherman from Guatemala, or no, was it from Guatemala? I can't remember the country, but I think it was from Guatemala. Not only what is your level of pain, but then he started on in what percentage has your level, has your pain increased or decreased, and it took like 3 tries until I said, doctor, the percentage is not coming across. Can you try something different? Because there is so much you can do with, with those situations as interpreters, and that caused so much trouble. And finally, if I understand both of you correctly, then the question is not going to have the effect you intended to, and then the answer is of course going to be wrong also. So if you have a research question that is not and translatable or is not understood by the end, or the person, then your research, how valid can it be, your
Yes,
research?
and it not only affects like cross-culturally or cross countries, but also in intra-country. Let's say I have an example of a questionnaire. It's called the Milo questionnaire. It's for patients with Alzheimer's, dementia, and in this case, the researcher did a good thing because she did like a cultural assessment. And this is in the very same process of development. So there are no other languages in that moment. But she took population from Hispanic population from the US and African American population to test that as well. And when she interviewed them, they just for English, right? And they told her, you can't use the word dementia. For us, it's very, very offensive, to call our family member like he has dementia or she has dementia. Because at the beginning, the questionnaire title included the word dementia. So they had to change it to, how was it? It's Milo, but it's, taking care for your loved one's health or something like that. No, so they had to change it to that. And also the African American population included other issues that they encountered, and they wouldn't answer some of the questions if asked that way. Yes. So what we do in translatability assessment, it's not only interlinguistic assessment, but it's intercultural, whether it's within the very same language and country or in relation to other countries and cultures. So it's a cultural translatability assessment. That's what we.
So you talk about the. Sorry, no, go ahead, Ma.
No. It's just sorry. I was going to say it's sociolinguistics, and anthropological linguistics. So it takes many other areas. It's psychology as well. So a person doing a translatability assessment cannot be only a regular translator. It needs to be. That's why Mark calls them the elite, because it's the people that we train. Because the course we are teaching it together, we have a specialization course on linguistic validation, and we are creating other courses as well. And they need to have these skills or develop them because it's much more complex. Sorry.
No, I think there is when you talk about intra-country variation, there's ethnicities, like for example in Spain, is a question understood the same in terms of resonance, not meaning, in terms of resonance to um, somebody who is ethnically Spanish versus somebody who's ethnically Romani. It could lead to. I've done testing in Andalusia, and there are differences. There are differences in data. It's the same here in the UK. If we're testing uh, uh, a questionnaire or a patient information leaflet on somebody who is from a white ethnic background versus somebody whose heritage is Jamaican or Punjabi. You can get very different responses. And I think just in terms of the creation of patient-facing information, whether it is a medication guide or a clinical questionnaire, you need to be designing for the world right from the beginning. You can't just, I mean, we're only just starting to understand what bias is. And so if I write a patient information leaflet, I'm going to be writing from my own worldview, from my own socio-economic, socio-cultural background. Um, and that needs to be defanged, I guess, from it needs to be removed. The bias needs to be removed from the earliest stage possible, and then think, okay, so I'm a scientist in Chicago and I'm developing this questionnaire. How can I make these questions resonate with someone in um, Seoul, Tokyo, Samoa, Lesotho, Paraguay? Just thinking about the whole world. And the only way you can do that is by having um, people from the target cultures in question have an active role in co-designing that text. Patients from those backgrounds as well.
And in the opposite way, like how do you, so that's like if you're creating this questionnaire, for example, you're a scientist and you want to do research on a population, you go through all this sort of like a process that you can describe more in detail about co-creating this with the community that is intended for. And then how, when you talk about patients' voice, and how it informs agencies. Are you talking about the same thing, or how do you, or there is a difference? So, in one way, this concept of patient voice is informing what agencies collect for feedback from like a population that's not the dominant language. Let's say, in the US we have 26 million people that don't speak the language. In what ways can the concept of patient voice research inform how an agency will collect feedback from them about the accessibility of public services, for example?
I think, I mean, public services, I assume you mean public health services, because otherwise it wouldn't be patient voice, it would just be people's voice if you're talking about.
Yes, no, you're
voice.
right.
So let's call it people's voice then. So it all depends on how sincere the organization is in terms of including that voice, whether we call it patient voice or people's voice or it's because sometimes it can be driven by ignorance. It can be driven by tokenism. It's like, oh, right, we've included one person from an African American background. Brilliant. Yes, that's the quota done. That's not sincere. That's just pure tokenism. Or we have Carol from Colombia. She's part of our panel, and check, that's done. but that's and a lot of organizations operate like that. I contributed to a book that it's just out of reach of my hand, and it's called something like patient centricity. That's another buzzword, like patient voice. Are
Centric,
we nearly,
yes.
yes, are we nearly there yet? No, we're not nearly there yet because the issue is that it's the patient or the person, the member of the public, is involved in such a way that's either too late, it can be right at the end of the process, like with the, when we do linguistic validation of questionnaires, it's right at the end of the process and nothing can be changed. And so, in many respects, that patient input is tokenistic. If nothing can be changed, it needs to be much further in. So, there's two dimensions: the sincerity and the moment in which the member of the public is involved. It needs to be right from the beginning.
Right. So, can you tell us how these linguistic validation methodologies could be repurposed to evaluate the effectiveness of any encounter that is mediated by an interpreter, for example, in healthcare and social services?
No.
Well, it's a great question. I think it's a great question because it pushes linguistic validation beyond its comfort zone, let's say, and I think it can be applicable, but like in let's say in a more intuitive way by the interpreter at the moment, because let's say the interpreter in this case is the linguistic validator, right? The equivalent. And of course, in the moment of the interaction, is not going to be going, forward translation, back translation, interviews with patients, etc. But I understand that every interpreter that is working in healthcare has to research, no, unless it's an urgent case and they just show up there and they don't know what happens to the patient and they have to just save the moment as best as they can. But if they know that they are going to be regularly with maybe supporting a family through a process, or they can do research and they can use all these tools, for example, of translatability assessment, but also of concept elaboration that we do. It's true that concept elaboration is done when we define terms so that we want to specify what they mean for the developer that has created the questionnaire, but also we clarify what we wanted to mean and what we want the patient to understand by that. And
before we jump, yes, I think that part of the question is also like if you can briefly walk us through what is the linguistic validation process, like so that we understand. Because I think I asked this in the old
assuming,
podcast.
yes, because we talked
But
in previous podcasts, yes.
But you mentioned a few steps, so it would be great for our audience to understand what's the methodology, and then from that, what can we extrapolate to the interpreting work, for example.
Briefly explain. Well, it's a very thorough methodology, and it's the result of, let's say, panels of experts that have come up with this through the years. It's not a perfect methodology. It has a lot of room for improvement, but at least is what we have so far in relation to different guidelines, that have been published. And when we have a questionnaire developed, whether it's in one language or another, we need to turn it into English so that from there we can translate it or validate it into whatever language, right? Because otherwise it would be very difficult to find experts. Like from, let's say, the questionnaire is originally developed in Japanese, and we just don't have these experts from Japanese to the rest of the world languages and so on. So it's
So
much
English
easier
is the
to
bridge
do that.
language. Is English the
Exactly.
bridge
No,
language? Okay.
it works as a koine for us, and with whatever original as reference, yes, in
Okay.
parallel. But the working source is English, and then what we do is ideally it has gone through translatability assessment, so all the cultural and linguistic issues for translating it into different languages have been at least solved or almost. But if not, the ideal thing is to do a translatability assessment to anticipate problems that we may encounter, and then write a concept elaboration, which is this definition in English from each of the terms of the questionnaire, and also provide alternatives. But it's not a glossary at all. It's a very complex document that takes into account sociolinguistic issues, psychological issues, etc. No? And it works a philosophical issue. So it's like a blueprint that every single linguistic validation specialist is going to be using, and the rest of the team to guide all the translations in the different languages, so we can attain, let's say, the same concepts, even though it's different languages. And it's a step that we do 2 forward translations, then an expert reconciles that and provides the best possible version, taking into account this map, no, that is the concept elaboration, and all that the person knows in her expertise in relation to culture, etc. And then we pass it to back translation, and then we compare the target in the sense of the translation, the back translation, and the source, and any discrepancies are considered. There is a work of research, of analysis, until we refine the translation. That new draft, it can go different ways. It can go to the developer so that the developer can check how the process is going. It could go to the client, and the client can check how it's going. It can go to a clinician specialized in the specific condition, and they review it conceptually. It can go to cognitive debriefing. It depends on the type of questionnaire. We're not going to get into that right now, but we tested with a sample of patients, normally between 5 and 10, for understanding and resonance. No, that's one of Mark's favorite words for this, but in truth, and acceptability as well. No, so we do these cognitive debriefing interviews with them, and then the results from that are analyzed, and we make decisions of what changes we are going to make. Patients, that's where the element of patient voice gets very present, because it's the patients informing us about how they understand, if something is offensive, how they would say it, what sounds natural, what doesn't, etc. And they suggest changes, so they help us improve that because of that, their direct lived experience with the condition. In this case, it's not qualitative interviewing in the sense that we get the experience with the illness of the patients as such, although they will share them with us at different points, because it's impossible for them not to tell their story, and it informs up to what point they are really understanding the questionnaire. But it's an exercise in understanding, and they are helping us. We are not evaluating them in any way. So then the result of that goes through, it can go back to the client for review, or it can go directly for bilingual reviews and proofreading, etc., until we just we say in Spanish pulir, lo pulimos hasta I don't remember now the word in English.
Polish it. Sorry?
Polish it, exactly.
Polish it, yes.
We polish it until it's absolutely patient facing, and it resonates, right? And then there is a moment where we do what is called a harmonization, where we put together all languages and see if they really are reflecting each of these concepts that we want to measure, and the cultural adaptations that have happened are necessary in terms of, for example, an idiom is not going to look the same in the different languages. It's going to be adapted, but it's still expressing the same, what's intended. So this is the process. So for an interpreter to maybe get from the process of linguistic validation and try to apply it, I would say it's more having the process integrated and then being able to first prepare, knowing the culture of the patient and knowing the specific condition. And so to do a kind of translatability assessment first but it's not going to be in terms of because a questionnaire is a structured interview, let's say, right? The questions are fixed. In this case, it would be a matter of probing more. No, it's more similar maybe to qualities that a qualitative interviewer may need to have, mixed with maybe, yes, cognitive debriefing, abilities for listening, and cultural competence, so that they may be able to anticipate offensive things and try to connect really with the patient. So listening and connection, I guess. Yes.
And I
So
think,
go ahead, Mark.
yeah, so I think there's cultural competence is one thing, but there's the true value is in the listening, and that is articulated as cultural humility. So it's because, like I live in a street. It's not a big street, but there are about 30 ethnicities there, and that's pretty typical of the city that I live in Leeds. It's very multicultural. And I can't possibly know everything there is to know about the do's and don'ts of those particular cultures just in my street. And so the practice is, listening, just like what can we learn from this group of people's needs, rather than whereas cultural competence is like a checklist. Colombian people do this, they don't do that. And it becomes
I was
inflexible.
just gonna say that sometimes, well, on one hand, when we are trying to be competent, we end up grouping everyone under one stereotype, like all Colombians do blah blah,
Exactly.
instead of listening, right? And maybe not everything is applicable to the interpreting world, because I think maybe they do have a different goals, right? So for example, as interpreters, we we have to we have to be accurate, and that's another concept that we can spend like another podcast talking about, because now you make me wonder what would that mean, right? Because if a doctor says something that could be perceived offensive in the culture, I have to say it, right, and risk that moment of offense, which might have been intended to be offensive. You know what I mean? Like, for example, doctor saying, how can this patient have been here 26 years and still didn't speak English? I had to interpret that. And the doctor was like, oh my God, you interpret that. But the patient, her reaction was like, I don't need someone to be insulting to me. And she changed the doctor. So I was like, good for you. So maybe not everything is applicable, but I think it's very important to listen to the patient, because I think in the interpreting world sometimes we have so many things coming at us in the encounter. Is one example is that we have the family on one side, the patient, the doctor, everybody, and we need to remind ourselves, I am here first for the patient and listening to what they say, because sometimes they get um, buried under all these other voices because everybody is worried about their care. And let's say this is a patient from El Salvador who has the specific example was somebody who had bladder cancer, and they were deciding what to do with him. And he was like, I want to go to El Salvador. And everybody was like, my dad needs to go to this clinic and the other and that. And he was like, I just want to go back home. And nobody was listening to that, even though.
Yeah.
So, so, so some of these communication strategies, like I think what you said was, um, I can remember the concept that you use for that part of the debriefing with patients, right? Cognitive debriefing. I wonder if that could be the aspect of linguistic validation that might be most applicable in an encounter, because I understand linguistic validation is a very long process and the purpose is different than the immediacy of the medical encounter. But I like the concept of cognitive debriefing and really checking for understanding, because you want to make
Exactly.
sure. Yeah. So I don't
That
know
that
if you
Yes.
wanted to say
that's
something.
exactly what I was going to say for this, like what Noah very, very correctly said, linguistic validation is not a perfect methodology. And so to apply it to something like interpreting, you can cherry pick what you want from it. So like thinking about translatability, but above all, the debriefing, because the debriefing is only a kind of usability testing. It's just asking the participant to talk back, to talk aloud what it means. So you could say, um, can you explain that in your own words? Or if you were to explain that to another person, what would what would the message be?
Yeah.
And that's where you get proof of understanding, proof of comprehension.
And
In
And
this
there's
case,
exactly.
you're
yeah, and
having two ways, two ways, because in cognitive debriefing, we're only doing it with the patient. We have, like, let's say, the questionnaire, but it's in their own language. In interpreting, you have it both ways. So it would be like an interview that you're doing with the doctor as well, because the doctor needs to understand as well and to interpret well what the patient is saying. So it's asking the doctor to have an open mind, and also to be culturally competent when, that's something that, and you bridge that gap when the doctor can't do that.
Yes.
No,
Yes,
so
I think.
it's very, very rich experience what interpreting in medical
and
I think
I think that
settings.
we all want to
that
talk. Mark, go ahead. Go
that's right. No,
ahead.
that situation gave me a lot of food for thought that you said about in the eye tests where you stepped in and recognized that it could be a question of literacy. And it made me remember a situation when I flew to Guatemala last year or a couple of years ago, and I was flying from Boston via Panama, so it was a long flight, and I was with my colleague from Guatemala, and there was an indigenous woman who was at the top of the escalator but was hesitant. And there was an American or European man behind him, and behind her, and he said, "Oh my God, just move, will you?" And I was thinking, what's her problem? What's the problem? And my colleague said she might not have experienced an elevator before. So
Yeah.
so it's just that deep cultural knowledge that
Yeah.
needs to come into play in that area. And I felt so ashamed that I was kind of siding with the let's call him an American man. In my mind, I was siding with that man, like, come on, hurry up, get down the escalator. But she was very hesitant.
I would like to mention something that maybe, well, I write poetry and I have a poem that's called The Ancient Library, and it makes me think of us humans as each of us an ancient library. And I'm going to read it because I think poetry sometimes expresses things where there are no words for it. So only poetry can do that. Curiously, it's words, but it's beyond that. No, it's like the language of the soul. And let's say talking as if it were talking for this person that couldn't recognize the bee, or trying to explain what's beneath uh, each person that comes from another country or is in another culture, and the doctor that it's just not taking into account all of that. And says, I thought I needed books written by wise people that would bring the wisdom I sought. All the centuries of creative minds leaving a legacy that we sometimes call words of genius. I saw myself overwhelmed by the million of manuscripts I would never read, feeling this vastness of the written word, paper bound or in virtual ink painted. And then I heard about the ancient library, the one built within as the monument of my lineage. The voices of old still pounding through the drum of my heartbeat, my ancestors' mine. And I say, I have a physical age, and yet I am ageless, and every cell contains their existence. In symbolic coding messages, we are all ancient libraries, holding the chants of our peoples, written in rivers of light, water, blood, and sand, flowing as the currents of a never-ending tale, sustained by the roots of wisdom, of lives lived, of lessons learned, of the endless feeling colors that enliven every breath that nurtures the book of what we call ourselves.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Thank you for sharing that, Noor. It really makes me think of how we really enrich ourselves by really sharing with other people and by trying to experience the world with them, something that a book could never do, right? And this is one of the reasons
Exactly.
why I love to travel is because I get to see the world from a different perspective. And I know not all of us can easily afford that, but going from patient to patient is like transiting the world in 80 different worlds, like
Exactly.
Jules
Exactly.
Verne wrote, kind of like backwards, but that's how I feel. And I know we don't have a lot of time, and I want to ask one more question if I can afford it. Um, but I wanted to just say something about what Mark said and what you said, Noor, about it goes both ways. On one side, I think the doctor who checks for understanding by asking, "Can you explain to me how can you explain to me what I just explained, but explain it to me?" I've seen doctors, savvy doctors, do that because, and then they can see all the gaps on the patient's understanding. So this particular case with a patient who had a retinoblastoma, and he spoke uh, Mixtec and Spanish, but there was me, the interpreter. There wasn't at the moment a Mixtec, but he spoke Spanish. But the problem was, and this was back in the day, so the problem was that he was also interpreting the content to mom in Mixtec. So it was a very complicated case because basically the child was blind and all that, and the doctor was explaining the cancer, the tumor, and a myriad other things. But when he asked the patient to explain it back, all he got was tumor and cancer, which were the major things. It's like once you hear that, it's like I don't even want to bother learning the other smaller things. So the idea that the healthcare professional needs to really come to the like heart to heart communication and come from wherever they are in their understanding of the world to where the patient is critical, and sometimes even more difficult than trying to take the patient to whatever the world of the doctor is. But both are important
Yes.
and
Yes.
have to be done. And those concepts are perfectly applicable, just not in the same way in the communication. And we really we need to have this conversation with language professionals that are interested in language access, because in my opinion that's really what language accessibility is. It's not so much having an interpreter there and just the person translating word for word, which is a discussion that I think it will never end. But my role is just to interpret, or my role is just to translate it, right? It's not to explain to the patient blah blah blah, and we can have all that conversation endlessly, right? Because the how do we delimit our role? Is our role just to interpret, or really we want to go a little beyond that and helping or making sure that there is understanding as well? So just to translate it, what are the risks of relying on literal or word for word translation in critical consent or intake or discharge documents? And how does your critique of just translated practices help address those risks in real healthcare settings? Because I think most healthcare providers that don't know anything about interpretation and translation, or even lawyers, I have had the specific request, just translate word for word verbatim. And I'm like, I can't do that. So what are those risks? How would you help people understand this? Why don't we start with you, Mark?
I think um, you've got to be, the risks of word to word or literal translations are, when we come to metaphor or figurative language is the biggest risk, because you could be translating something that is a common idiom in English, but absolutely nonsensical. For example, I remember being involved in the linguistic validation of a questionnaire where it had the phrase, I am waiting for the other shoe to drop. And that was translated literally in 30 languages. And so when you get to Indonesian, and they say like this question, what does this question mean to you? It's saying that I am waiting for the other shoe to drop. Well, they understand the words, but what does it mean? And um, so that's the biggest risk factor for me, just the translation of metaphor and the associated figurative language, and also that you can't take anything for granted. You can't take absolutely anything for granted. We come up with the term of cultural courting and cultural stripping. So a word, just let's say cancer, for example, that word in English has been kind of sanitized over the years. Before, it used to carry a lot of dreadful weight on it. And now, because of treatments and because of prognoses, improvements, it doesn't carry the weight that it did, but it still does in many, many languages. So you translate cancer from English to Arabic, then it it acquires all of this coating, almost like an enamel coating on a piece of ceramics, that is additional, that wasn't there in the source. And then the opposite of that is cultural stripping, where a word can lose nuance and connotation and that kind of thing from one language to the other. And so nothing can be taken for granted. Not even, I mean, we know the word you, for example. We've seen how many situations, how many documents have you seen, Noel, where there's a mismatch between tu and usted in questionnaires for children? where it's all mixed. Some questions are upstairs and some questions are cool, which is absolutely nonsensical. So there's that. Just everything needs to be taken into account.
The risks also are huge when it comes to patients misunderstanding the question and responding differently, because it can absolutely, let's say, destroy the entire clinical trial, because patients are responding that maybe an intervention is just terrible. And they wanted to say the contrary, but the question as it was asked just, was misinterpreted. So it's as impactful as that. Or, for example, it can lead to, in cases of disability, they are being evaluated for disability, and these questionnaires are being used as well in those processes. And if the patient has misinterpreted the symptoms, and they have responded that they have milder symptoms that they really have, they may not get disability.
Exactly.
So
yes.
It has, very, and to the impact of even, if the family in let's say countries where same-sex relationships are penalized, well, it can cause that person terrible damage. If those questions haven't been adapted, and there's an interview where maybe the wife is there and the husband is present and they ask for questions, or the father is present and the son is there and is answering questions related to homosexuality. So it's as serious as that.
Yeah, there are so many risks, and I think that part of the goal with this podcast, and the efforts that we're doing with language access is really getting to the core of that misunderstanding that many professionals have, that translation is not just simple transfer word for word, and it's much more than that, and that we need to be mindful of all the cultural aspects, the intersectionality aspects of the person, because you mentioned something very important, Nur. It's not just the culture. Like, a person can be in Colombia but be 70 years old, and the treatment of that person is going to be dramatically different than a person from the same country, from the same family, that's 20 years old. I mean, for example, my father, for example, his notion of the world is such that sometimes he might not even distinguish some video that's AI, whereas a 12-year-old person that's like, this is obviously AI, for example. So
yes.
same location, same culture, but really different intersections of that culture. So this is so important. And I know we don't have any more time, but I want you to promise me to do a second part of this, because there is so much material to cover. This is a fascinating topic, and I think it will help people really get a grasp of all the nuances involved in your work, and how important it is, and how we could use it in other industries. We only talk about the medical industry, but I'm curious to know application elsewhere, right? Because in the legal world, for example, I see also communication issues with compounding questions that are never going to get the result that that we intended for. So promise
Of
we are going to
course.
do another one.
Yes,
Yeah.
because qualitative interviewing just came from social sciences, right? So it's something that social sciences can perfectly, explain all of this. And yes.
It's the same skill set as a good journalist interviewing technique. It's pretty much the same as that.
Yeah, so I definitely look forward to do more questions on this. And thank you both Nur and Mark, for agreeing to record this podcast. You are two people that are have impacted my own professional view of language access, and it has enriched it. So I thank you for coming today.
Thank you as well, because with all the work you do, also you're an inspiration, and you have inspired us as well. So it's mutual. It's mutual.
Absolutely.
Thank you for all the work you do every day,
Yeah.
for that heart and spirit you have, and strength, to change things. So thank you.
Thank you both. And that's a wrap for today's conversation with Mark Gibson and Nur Ferrante. What stays with me from everything we discussed today is, and I don't want to simplify, is that the linguistic validation at its core is an act of respect. It says to the patient, not only your language matters, but your understanding matters, and your experience of the information and the interaction you have with this information also matters. And to me, that's the foundation of equitable care. At Equal Access Language Services, that belief drives everything we do. And for those of you in healthcare leadership, whether you are running a hospital system, leading a clinic, overseeing patient experience, or setting language access policy, today's conversation was for you. A patient who doesn't fully understand their diagnosis or their discharge instructions or their consent form isn't really what you want. They are in fact at risk, and the systems that were meant to protect them have definitely fallen short. But the good news is that all of that is solvable, and you don't have to figure it out alone. If today's conversation has you thinking about how your organization approaches language access, I want to speak directly to you, the healthcare leader who knows something needs to change but isn't sure where to start. And I am going to talk briefly about effective inclusion through language access, who is a course that we built exactly for that moment of doubt that some healthcare leaders might have. This course is designed for healthcare professionals and organizational leaders who are ready to move beyond compliance checklists and into cultural grounded, patient-centered practice. So I'm going to drop the link below. And if your organization is ready to build language access programs that truly serve the patient population, reach out to us directly at Equal Access Language Services. Until next time, keep listening, keep reading, and remember, when every patient can be heard and understood in their own language, everyone receives better care. This has been Language Access Matters, brought to you by Equal Access Language Services.
And that wraps up another enlightening episode of Language Access Matters. We hope you have enjoyed our discussion on the profound impact language access has across various sectors of society. Let's remember that language access is not just an isolated topic. It intertwines with various fields, impacting lives and businesses in profound ways. As we continue this journey together into becoming a more inclusive society where we ensure equal access to services to those who don't speak the dominant language, we want to assure you that our company, Equal Access Language Services, through its podcast Language Access Matters, will be with you every step of the way. We are committed to bringing you thought-provoking conversations, expert opinions, and stories from the field and beyond. To dive deep into the subject matter and engage with leading experts in the field, we will release a new episode of Language Access Matters once a month. By featuring expert practitioners and individuals with diverse experiences, we aim to broaden the scope of our discussions and present a comprehensive view of the importance of language access. We encourage you to stay connected with us through our website, www.equalaccesslanguageservices.com, and our social media platforms. You can join the conversation, ask questions, and share your own stories and experiences. If you want to be part of our podcast, email us to podcast@equalaccesslanguageservices.com. Remember, language access matters to each and every one of us. By understanding its significance and actively working towards its advancement, we can create a more inclusive and equitable society. Thank you for being a part of the Language Access Matters community. We appreciate your support and look forward to sharing more knowledge, inspiration, and empowerment with you in our future episodes.